So when you think of Western animation, your mind goes to places like Disney, doesn't it? Immediately it goes to Disney or Pixar or DreamWorks or Sony or some other huge company that's been around for years and years and years and years and years. And if there was any place in the West that people think of regarding the animation industry, it is California, the West Coast, Hollywood, United States of America. The place with all the sunshine and hot people and industry and money and jobs, right? Well, there used to be jobs, not so much now. But it's also the place that set the standard for the types of stories people have come to expect from the medium as a whole. Once upon a time, when I was a young and ignorant poor kid from a dying post-industrial town in northern England, I had dreams of running away from my hometown and travelling to somewhere sunny and optimistic like California, where people weren't so obviously burdened with economic decay, to work for somewhere like Cartoon Network and make cartoons like I always wanted. That dream was very quickly nipped in the bud though when I found out how expensive places like Cali were to live in, or how extensive a working visa or immigration process would be, or how poor I actually was, and also how a lot of my ideas that were very deeply rooted in British culture at this point likely wouldn't translate well unless they were transformed into something that I probably wouldn't recognise, if they were even picked up at all, which it seems no one is able to be that fortunate these days. Also, I have friends and family who depend on me, so running off like that was never really an option anyway, let's be honest. And for some reason, I've been thinking that over a lot lately, about how this one place has such a big lion's share of being able to define what the animation formula is all about, and how despite so much of a cultural shift there has been in terms of people being able to work from all corners of the globe, it's managed to maintain that image of a paragon of creative aspiration in the eyes of the wider public. I've also been thinking about how recently that share may feel like it's gotten smaller due to other studios developing outside of it, thanks in part to a more global movement, but also not. Because so many creators, myself included, are so influenced by a lot of what it put out throughout the years that we are still almost subconsciously trying to replicate the very same formula Hollywood perfected, even if we're trying to do so in both a different location, and even when it feels like we're trying to do something drastically different that Hollywood historically wouldn't have allowed. It's something that's been gnawing at my mind ever since both the rise of remote working and also people bringing up topics about grassroots studios becoming more aligned with the mainstream after becoming successful, and even in more niche discussions like how indie dialogue sounds a certain way. How different can you actually make something before it starts getting criticised for that too? Honestly, it kind of feels like it's a lose-lose either way. I really hope that what I just said makes sense and that you're willing to still follow along with what I'm trying to put down here, but hello everyone! My name is fionapollo and I talk about animation because it's something I've loved since I was small. Actually, I loved it so much that when I was around 5 or 6, something like that, I was banned from watching cartoons because I picked up an American accent. That happens a lot, apparently. Remember when American kids were watching Peppa Pig and became British? Thankfully, though, I was also exposed to other types of animation that didn't just come from the States, which helped broaden my horizons. I got to grow up with a lot of BBC shows, then I got really into anime as a teenager, and then I also started looking into international films as well. But it always felt kind of enforced that the only way to truly succeed in the animation field was to somehow get a job working on a big blockbuster animated feature film. And for the longest time, the only surefire way to do that was by joining a big American studio. This video is largely inspired by a series I have going on my channel called Inspiring Animators. Basically, I started looking at a bunch of prominent animators who have done great things in the industry in order to balance out all the current doom and gloom going on. I examined their careers, how they got there, and the impact their works have had. Except I've already encountered a bit of a problem. Most of these big animators, and especially the ones that viewers respond to the strongest, are almost all born in or were able to move to America and had the privilege of being able to receive some form of specialized art-based education when they were young, and were able to move to LA without much friction. And to be honest with you guys, even though what these people have done is amazing, it's not particularly inspiring me, the person making the videos, because that is completely unattainable for both myself and a vast majority of creatives, and that likely also includes many Americans who don't have the funds or the ability to relocate to another side of the country for the sake of following a very competitive dream career. I wanted to go into the whole media culture surrounding animation and how there is this simultaneous reevaluation of Hollywood's historic grip on the medium's creative liberties and monopoly of the creative workforce, combined with how this grip has influenced or affected projects that are being created outside of it within a more globalized indie movement. I do just want to preface that I don't think made in Hollywood or Hollywood-inspired projects are a bad thing, nor do I bemoan people who actually had the opportunity to pack up everything and move to where all the big studios are at. Like, I'll fully admit that there's probably a bit of envy in the mix here, but I'm also just fascinated by how culture develops in such a way that we end up accepting things that we've never really thought to examine previously until it begins to destabilize. And by God, things in the creative sphere feel so unstable these days. So I wanted to discuss it a bit. I hope that's all right. If it is, and you like the sound of what I'm putting down, then please consider liking and subscribing. I'm a big fan of the indie animation scene and have put out a few videos on it already, in addition to other topics surrounding pop culture and the wider art world. So there's bound to be something for you to enjoy. But enough with the preamble, let's get into it.
Sorry, I don't speak Italian.
So I wanted to talk a bit about my personal thoughts and feelings surrounding this proximity topic in a literal sense first, before moving on to the whole, ooh, everything is LA kind of spiel. And again, I do just want to preface that there is nothing wrong with living in LA and following that pipeline of moving there for your creative career, when in fact that is an incredibly admirable thing you've been able to do, if there's anyone watching who was able to do that. But this topic is something I've been thinking about a lot since the turn of the decade and has only become louder with the rise of the indie scene. And so I think the best place to begin is with the shift in office culture and remote working. And to do that, I'm gonna go back to my time during good old COVID. So when I started my master's in 2020, I became friends with a guy who went to film school in Canada and then moved to Bangladesh to live with his dad. His dad wanted him to expand his job prospects in the field by elevating his education, hence why he was doing a master's in the UK, as unfortunately at the time there was no postgraduate programs for animation specifically in Bangladesh. The closest you could get would be like a multimedia degree that would cover it as one of the modules, but not as the main subject. Just bear in mind this was pre-2020's info and courses might be available now that some time has passed, but that was just what he told me. And after finding out you could also pursue a PhD in the subject, his dad wanted him to look into that, because then he would have been one of very few people in Bangladesh, possibly even the first, to have that kind of qualification from what I remember of the conversation. And I bring this up because I want people to understand how much more extensive a journey it is to cultivate a skill and bring it over to where you live when you are one of the first persons to do so. I think we kind of take for granted that animation is in fact an export product of the States until it becomes reshaped in other parts of the world who interpret it within their own method of working. But to do that, it requires you to build up from almost nothing and also build higher than you would in other places if you lived somewhere that doesn't really have a prominent foothold in the industry. So when places all around the world started shutting operations in the middle of our course due to lockdown and moving everything online, this was a pretty mountainous shift in the animation world specifically, as it was one of the very few entertainment mediums that was able to just fully embrace remote working, with some small exceptions like stop motion. And it forced Hollywood to acknowledge it more seriously, at least for a bit. There were no real-world studio sets or camera equipment needed to create an animation. Everything could be done through your home PC, and that even extended to other aspects of production, like voice acting. So long as you had the gear, which many working professionals did at home or were able to now invest in thanks to things like furlough or less money spent during a commute depending on where you lived, as well as Zoom or Microsoft Teams to communicate with your co-workers, animation more or less carried Hollywood through the pandemic because it was one of the few mediums that could carry on with production as normal. Myself and this friend actually ended up working as a team, scouring different corners of the internet for animation jobs that would be willing to employ students during this time. And we ended up finding a couple of amateur projects on several Facebook groups. And that was essentially how we both continued paying rent for a couple of months. It was honestly pretty enlightening. It had never occurred to me before that time that you wouldn't need a studio to work in, because this style of working had never been done at scale before. It was just assumed that in order to get the most out of your production, you needed to work in-house. And yet it's very easy to see now how it revolutionized a lot of people's working habits, to the point where many younger workers now in particular prioritize working from home a few days a week over higher salaries. It obviously wasn't just remote working that allowed for this to happen. Almost every aspect of the production process had also moved away from traditional methods and could now be done completely digital. And that's absolutely not to say that the traditional studio way of working is obsolete, because it's not. In fact, it's probably stronger than ever, with people wanting to cultivate these spaces, just with the added perk of also wanting to work from home for a couple of days, which has in fact proven to help people feel much more productive and like they have a greater sense of work-life balance. And because of all of this going on, these studios realized they didn't just have to choose from the pool of talent living within that singular location. And so a boatload of opportunities also opened up for animators who lived across the globe. COVID was such an incredibly turbulent time where so many people were having these juxtaposed experiences all at the same time. It unfortunately wasn't all positive, as we know. A lot of tragedies occurred, a lot of corruption was exposed, but I genuinely thought that this was at least one good thing that came from the entire situation. By about about 2023 to 2024, though, people were already being dragged back to offices or studios, and fully remote workers became much more of a rarity than they did at the height of lockdown. This on its own isn't really the big issue, though. But one thing I thought, and also kind of wished was going to happen, was that studios and companies would realise that they didn't have to station their creative bases within the big cities, and would be willing to go further afield to places that maybe don't have as much of a stronghold in certain industries, so long as the job got done. I was genuinely hoping that COVID would be a turning point for people who lived in more disadvantaged areas, because it would show companies that they didn't have to stick to these big metropolitan areas in order to thrive. And I don't know, it just seems like we've kind of gone back to normal. Money and resources almost seem to have scaled back even further and clustered more intensely around these hotspots. It's more than a bit demoralising, and a big part of the reason why I ultimately chose not to pursue it professionally, even after my education. Just trying to survive the pandemic in another city almost financially crippled me and left me with a bunch of other issues on top of that. And also, my equivalent of Cali would be London. And after dealing with all of that, honestly, the last thing I wanted to do was take another huge risk by moving to a huge, expensive city where thousands of people like me were in competition for the same jobs. And that's without looking at people who maybe can't commute due to a chronic illness, or someone who has kids, or any other number of things. And people who are born in these areas also feel the strain from effectively being priced out of their hometowns thanks to the influx of professionals from all over. And I don't know, I think I've just become kind of resentful of big cities that have a huge concentration of industries, because they effectively become this huge brain drain on the surrounding areas, and they leave so many people with little other choice between potentially putting their entire livelihood to chance, or choosing stability and losing any and all possible opportunities because they don't live in the right place. It's just kind of an impossible position that a lot of people find themselves in. It shouldn't be like that. We were almost there when it came to remote working, and even though I can imagine that some aspects of it may be a logistical challenge for employers, it was nice to dream for a while that maybe you could have your cake and eat it. But I guess we still have a bit to go before then, don't we?
Hi, Mr. Flag. Obama!
Sheesh, well, that was a bit of a depressing note. But thankfully, not everything is bogged down by all of these issues, because a lot of creators by this point kind of went through this collective epiphany regarding how they wanted both themselves and their projects to be treated. After it became apparent, and also frequent, that big companies were laying off creative staff, only prioritizing existing IPs, forcing creatives through these arduous bake-off style pitch sessions, which is where a bunch of creatives pitch these interesting shows to the same company and only one gets selected, or even worse, outsource certain practices to machines. Well, after all of that, people had enough. This combined with the fact that there is not a single industry, never mind creative ones, that are safe from layoffs at the moment. There's a growing sense of, well, if I'm going to be struggling either way, whether I choose a sensible career or follow my passions, fuck it, I'm going to follow my passions. Wouldn't you know it? We ended up with a veritable explosion of creative projects sprouting forth as a result of the current indie movement. Many creatives found that they could easily promote and platform the works they actually wanted to create without all the needless rigmarole or sanitizations that were demanded by big corpo. And best of all, these indie creators weren't being restricted to where they lived. Take for example the Ebony Witch, which was among 17 Kenyan projects awarded $190,000 in funding through France's Creation Africa 2025 programme. The project also raised $12,000 through Kickstarter in 2024 and became a huge hit in countries outside of both Kenya and France, which is something that likely wouldn't happen without the initiative of independent creatives to spotlight such projects. People have also been looking towards international film festivals a lot more as well, rather than looking solely at mainstream releases. Several independent projects being made in all manner of places are being showcased, such as, for example, The Lovers by Studio Heartbreak, an independent Filipino film that has now wrapped up production and is being showcased at the Annecy Festival in France. It's also worth noting that Studio Heartbreak has a remote team that is spread across several countries, including the Philippines, Indonesia, and Brazil. We are at a point where so many are now opening up to the idea of making what they want, where they want, and even though that has always been an option, it's not a new thing by any means, it's just been so validating seeing people just go fuck it and give things a try. Even if it's not perfect, even if it's not finished, we've had several indie projects that are just animatics but are still hugely loved, and having those projects be found and appreciated by so many across the world. I'm steadily chugging along with my own project, which is admittedly taking a while because it is literally just me, one background artist, and the voice actors making a bunch of shorts. But one of the VAs actually went to a con recently and asked to take a couple of prints that they could autograph and hand out, and it turns out that that they ended up meeting someone who, despite living in the States, has heard of and enjoys Mint and Friends even at its current stage. And I don't think I can accurately describe how much it still hits me that people from across the Atlantic are aware of what I do and genuinely like it. Like, I know I have a YouTube audience who support me, but just hearing about it happen in the wild, it's still such a mind blower. And it speaks to the power of creating something just for you without worrying about its broader appeal, because the right people will find it. But even with that said, I think some of that appeal does stem from some of the broader concepts within it. For one thing, my project is very LGBTQ oriented, and so it will obviously appeal more to people in that community, but that also means it'll more likely be enjoyed in places where queer people are more openly accepted or tolerated. I do often find myself wondering as well how the reception of Mint and Friends would differ if, for example, several of the characters had accents like mine, and what led me to make the decision to not go ahead with that. And to be honest with you all, I think I did that because I knew that the larger demographic of animation fans are from the Americas, but also because I've seen audiences in the past misinterpret why certain creative or narrative choices were made within a story that takes place or was made in a certain part of the world. And while Mint and Friends wasn't made to exist within a world that was one-to-one with our own, it is interesting to deconstruct what aspects of our world made it in. And just one more time for the people in the back before we go any further, I don't think that the core issue is the fact that these shows have what I'm going to refer to as Americanisms, because I'm worried that this video might be coming across as a bit like anti-America, which is not the point I'm trying to make. It would be the exact same thing if this idea of a mainstream formula originated from practically any other country in the world. The whole accent thing in particular is more so just an observation of how places with the biggest and wealthiest populations will almost always have things catered to them on a grander scale. Just to give a bit more context as to what I mean by Americanisms, it's kind of a hard thing to explain, but it can encompass a couple of different things. It can be narrative structure, it can be the emotional beats, it can be the resolutions that are involved, it can be the way that certain shots are framed. Like, for example, I think one of the big hallmarks is that Hollywood is very fond of happy endings, or at the very least, bittersweet endings, but not every story in the world has a happy ending, and a lot of those tend to get pushed to the side or sanitized or censored when it comes to US productions. I think I'm finding it a little bit difficult to define because it's very vibe-based. Like, you look at something and you can immediately tell that it's inspired by Hollywood because of the way it's structured. So even though the concept of my project originally stemmed from my own experience as a British person moving to a different town in pursuit of a better livelihood, it still took inspiration from various outside influences, and to an extent, it also kind of derives from a sort of modernized concept of the American dream. For example, with my main character Mint, their backstory was actually inspired by Dylan Mulvaney, an American influencer turned actress who documented her transition via her TikTok videos, which ended up going viral, which then ended up affording her a wealth of opportunities, including an interview with former US President Joe Biden. And we know of this story because it had a lot of online coverage, whereas similar success stories in other countries might not. But coming back to less niche productions, I think this is something that has to an extent also been noticed by casual fans of the indie space, but not always positively. I'm personally pretty neutral on the delivery of certain performances or narratives because I grew up with a lot of region-specific shows that don't particularly translate outside of their home base, and that's probably why cringy shows don't bother me all that much. One issue I have noticed though is that, like anything online, when certain productions or projects break containment, it always gets hit with a ton of criticism. This is too weird, this is too mainstream, this is too cringe, it's too serious, it's too cartoony, it's too realistic. I think you get the gist. There's actually a tweet that's been going around which encapsulates my thoughts on this phenomenon quite well. The biggest problem with art as a whole right now is people treat indie artists as soulless megacorporations, and people treat soulless megacorporations like indie artists. And that is more or less the crux of the discussion. Quite a large chunk of the excitement surrounding indie is that people want Hollywood quality shows that are original and accessible. And that doesn't just extend to fans. Many creators' motivations towards producing certain works is because they were sick of waiting around for these mega studios to push out something that catered to them while still following that age-old formula, and instead they wanted to try their hand at replicating the magic of the shows they love or grew up with. So they're still kind of following along to this recipe, they just might not always have the same ingredients. Which, if we're being honest, the main ingredient is money. It's always fucking money. Regular people don't have millions to drop on a perfectly polished cartoon, we all know this. I think what I'm trying to get at is that people are very quick to swing at something and say it's bad if it showcases any attempt at replicating existing media, while doing so in a way that people are not used to seeing. If someone grew up with Disney princesses, then it makes sense that they lean more towards magical fairy tale shows that center around girls. But that also works the same in that someone who is perhaps jaded in response to how corporate or formulaic certain properties might come across can end up either wanting to seek something different, or the more likely outcome, complain endlessly while still engaging with them. And unfortunately, I hate to say it, but a lot of that criticism does come from people on the internet who grew up on a diet of mainstream cartoons. The wider demographic of non-artists who passively enjoy things are 10 times more likely to want something they're already familiar with, so it makes sense that even if it might be something they could potentially enjoy or relate to more closely if they do so happen to not be from the States, they're still going to question why it's not the same anyway. So, to try and wrap up this hodgepodge of a topic, basically, as someone who comes from a working class background and didn't have the opportunity to pursue an animation career in my own country, let alone jet set off to the States, I've been re-examining a lot of my views on art and storytelling in relation to what I thought I wanted to see some years ago, compared to what I want to see now. And what I want to see now is just a lot more stuff from different parts of the world and different stories that I haven't been exposed to yet. And I'm also a lot less burdened now about the idea of having to leave the place I'm comfortable living in, or the people I love, or who depend on me to pursue something that might not work out. I'm also not as bothered about relying on these big studios to deliver the stories I and others want to see, because we are now so much more capable of doing it ourselves. It's been really inspiring to see how people realize that working remotely and collaborating with other people around the world has enabled them to take their projects into their own hands and allow it to be seen and enjoyed by others without going through the arduous process of leaving everything you know behind and burying yourself to a mega studio, only to potentially come away with nothing to show for it because it either didn't make it past the pitching stage or was cast aside for a tax write-off. But there is also something to be said about evaluating the way in which we have been influenced or inspired by these studios and, by proxy, their country of origin. Not because of any kind of negative bias or attribution to any specific location, but because of how many different kinds of stories are out there that don't follow its conventions or focus on the same kinds of things. And those deserve to be seen as well, in my opinion. I think this video was meant to be more so geared towards fellow non-US creators who might also have occasional thoughts about how our experiences and preferences are adapted within our own works to suit a more generalized audience, and how that generalized audience has been synonymized with American preferences. And I don't think that's something people from the States tend to even realize is a thing that happens, but I also don't want anyone to think that that's their fault or a criticism. It's just food for thought, really. And I'm hoping it also emboldens any US creatives out there not to box yourself into what you think defines an all-American production. If I had to deliver some bit of random advice, it would be to pay no mind as to how much or how little your project may be inspired by popular things or where those inspirations come from, but do still try to have a think about why they inspire you to create things in a certain manner. I think the internet, despite the many opportunities it affords to people to get their stories out there, also emboldens those who otherwise wouldn't be so forthcoming with every little one of their misgivings to just throw out an endless slew of critique. But you don't have to listen. Same as how you don't have to listen to me. I'm just chatting shit for the love of the game half the time. I'm not even gonna lie to you. You know, I saw one of my friends at a party last week and he told me that he'll look through what I've uploaded every once in a while and see one that just makes him go, Fiona, what the fuck is this? And honestly, I look back at some of the things I've made and I'm like, yeah, same. Same. But either way, now that more international creative works are becoming more popular than ever, I do wonder if this conversation might pop up for anyone else. It's been interesting to think about, and I don't think I've even fully passed out how to feel about it. But I'll be sure to look at the comments from you guys, so feel free to share any additional thoughts, or just let me know if I've been spitting complete nonsense, because I probably have. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. I have been dragging myself half dead on the floor to get this uploaded because so much has been going on. I have a couple more videos to do for July, and then I'm probably going to take a break in August to focus properly on Mint and Friends, so wish me luck. Anyway, thank you as always to my wonderful Patreon supporters. I really do appreciate you sticking with me. Thank you to my YouTube peeps, Manuel Lagzon Gonzalez, Mystic Mind, Lauren R, Ash Valentine, Lonim the Her, Craig, Edboy, Pedantic Cat, Steph Goods Doodles, Why Not Warrior, and Tai Shan. And an extra special thank you to my indie production supporters, Morgan LaFade Thin, Matty A, Kiyoshi, Roundcat, Arsonist, and Nomad Bob. If you're interested in joining the Patreon, a link can be found in the video description. Stay safe everyone, and I will speak to you all very soon. Bye!